Hi everyone. I'd love to share some thoughts on this week's Parsha, which is Parshas Vayeishev. So we have two interesting incidents in this week's Parsha, which seem unrelated, but actually have a very interesting common thread. The first incident is everything surrounding Yosef being thrown into the pit, right? So we know that Yosef was the darling of his father. He was Rachel's son. He was the favorite son. His father treated him preferentially. He gave him this multicolored coat. And that, coupled with the fact that he had a history of tattling on his older brothers when they would do something wrong, made him very unpopular amongst his brothers, and they were very resentful of the position that he held in his father's eyes. And we're introduced to him in the beginning of the Parsha. His brothers are out in the fields shepherding, and his father Yaakov sends him out to check on them. And he approaches them, and not only are they already resentful of him, but he shares these two dreams that he's had, one, involving the sun, the moon, and the stars, and the other involving sheaves of wheat. The interpretation, which comes across correctly, is that he is telling his brothers that they will one day be subservient to him and bow down to him, and his father and his mother will bow down to him. So his brothers are understandably enraged, and they conclude that it's their moral obligation to kill him. So they're tossing around different ideas of how to kill him in sort of a secondary way, not directly by their own hands. One of the suggestions is shooting arrows at him from afar. The other is releasing wild dogs on him. And we know that Reuven makes an alternate suggestion. He says, instead of doing those two things, why don't we throw him in a pit and just let him die there? But the words the Torah uses to describe Reuven's suggestion is that Reuven rescued him. And the reason is because we know that Reuven had good intentions. His intentions were to let Yosef be thrown into the pit and then come back later and rescue him, which he was not even successful in doing. By the time he came back, Yosef had already been sold into slavery. But the Torah credits him for his good intentions, and that's why it's written that Reuven rescued him. The Medrash says that if Reuven had known how it would have been worded, he would have done exactly that. He would have actually rescued him instead of something that just spoke to his intentions. He would have slung him over his shoulder and not let anybody touch him. And we even know that the series of events, the catalyst of Yosef being thrown into the pit, sort of sparked the series of events. Yosef, wound up in Mitzrayim. He was in the jail. He became the viceroy. He rose to power, ultimately leading to Bnei Yisrael coming down to Mitzrayim and eventually being enslaved there. So we know that that would not have turned out differently, right? Bnei Yisrael was destined to be enslaved. Hashem told Abraham, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. So the ultimate result would have happened anyways, but had Reuven acted differently and not allowed Yosef to be a part of it, it might not have come about because of our own internal sort of family drama, family strife. It might have come about from just outside sources. So the second incident is how Yosef is described. In the second pasuk of this week's Parsha, we're introduced to Yosef. It describes him as a youth, and Rashi interprets that word as meaning he was youthful, he was vain, he liked to fix his hair, he liked to preen, he liked to adorn his eyes, he enjoyed being handsome. And this is something that he's accused of again in Potiphar's house, right? That he was grooming his hair and that he was vain. But it's a little hard to reconcile that image of Yosef with what we know of him. After all, Chazal call him Yosef HaTzadik, which is a moniker reserved for very few people. We know that he was righteous. We know that he upheld his standards of living even while he was in the depths of Mitzrayim. We know that he was similar to Yaakov, and we know that he withstood the temptation of Eshes Potiphar. So how do we reconcile these two descriptions of Yosef, one being youthful and vain, and the other one being this real tzaddik? So Rabbi Shimon Schwab suggests an alternate interpretation of the word youth. And the proof that he brings is where it's used to describe Shechem. The incident where Shechem is described as a youth is when he's offered to marry Dinah, the sister of the Shvatim. He jumps at the chance, but the condition is that he has to circumcise himself and his entire nation, which he does immediately, without thinking through how that would make him vulnerable. And sure enough, after these circumcisions, his entire nation is weakened, and Shimon and Levi come and they slaughter everybody. So this word youth, and we know that he was not even particularly chronologically young at that time. So this word youth doesn't necessarily speak to only vanity or actual age, but it speaks to sort of an impulsiveness, a short-sightedness, not thinking things through all the way. We know psychologically that is true, that before a certain age, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, so that seems to make a lot of sense. Versus the word zaken, which the Talmud says is an acronym for someone who has acquired wisdom. Zeh shekana chachma. And wisdom, how do we think of wisdom? Wisdom is not something you gain from a textbook, but wisdom is something you gain through experiential knowledge, right? Things that you have experienced, you sort of know how they'll play out because you've been through it before. And that's the opposite. Zaken being someone who's wise, someone who's seen things played out, and who is capable of thinking things through to their terminus. So Yosef was correct in his predictions, right? He was right. His brothers were destined to bow down to him. His mistake was in, number one, maybe sharing that prediction too early. And number two, he sort of acted in the role as king also prematurely and too early, including at Potiphar's house, where he was had not yet risen to power. He was not there yet. We know from Navi that the halachos of a king of Bnei Yisrael is that he needs to be well-groomed, he needs to be presentable and attractive. But Yosef was engaging in that process and in those behaviors before it befitted him and before it was really time. So the behaviors were correct, the interpretations were correct, but the entire thing was premature and impulsive. When it comes to Reuven, his intentions were correct and his actions were correct. But had he known the long-term ramifications, not only how it would be written in the Torah, but even the long-term ramifications of, he and his brothers and Yosef being involved in the enslavement of their own people, he may have acted differently, right? So the timing at which you do things and the degree to which you do things really sometimes can take some forethought before we decide how to act. So the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva asks us to think of every action we do as being the one that will tip the scales, right? We are judged on our actions the entire year. The entire world is judged throughout the year. And we're meant to think of everything we do as the one that could tip the scales left or right, to good or to bad. It's a hard concept to relate to most of the time. There's 7 billion people on this planet. And do I really matter? How much does each individual action really matter? But we know that the Mishnah says that one life is like a universe, right? And if you save a life, you save a universe. But even individual actions are so powerful, and they can really have significant long-term effects, even if you're doing the correct action. But the timing that you do it and the degree to which you do it can really change the entire story. So it's incumbent upon us to kind of zoom out when we're acting, make sure that our intentions are correct, our timing is correct, the action itself is correct. Make sure we're applying our wisdom to our choices and calibrating ourselves towards long-term success, not just short-term fulfillment. Sometimes it definitely takes guidance and input from someone that we know has wisdom if we feel like our wisdom is not sufficient. And this is how we can ensure that everything we're doing is correct and will be the action that tips the scales towards the good. Shabbos.